I am Mitchell Foster, 70 years old, and until recently, I believed a father's love could guide a son through any temptation. I was wrong. On my son's wedding day, my new in-laws mocked me in front of 500 high society guests. They sneered at my worn suit and called me trash to my face. Even my own son stayed silent, embarrassed by my perceived poverty. I slowly stood up, ready to leave, until my son grabbed my arm to stop me from ruining their photos. I looked at all of them and calmly stated that they saw a poor old man, but I was actually a billionaire. The entire room went dead silent. Before I continue this story, let me know which city you are listening from in the comments below. Please hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth based on appearances. The Oakhaven estate was a towering monument to aggressive extravagance. As I steered my 1998 Ford pickup truck up the winding, meticulously paved driveway, the sheer scale of the event became glaringly apparent. Valets in crisp white uniforms scrambled around a circular courtyard choked with imported sports cars and stretched luxury sedans. I parked my weathered truck near the back of the service lot, completely ignoring the confused and judgmental stares of the parking attendants. I stepped out into the crisp evening air, smoothing the lapels of the dark wool suit I had worn to my late wife's funeral 5 years ago. It was an off-the-rack garment, simple and clean, entirely devoid of designer labels or flashy tailoring. I walked toward the grand entrance, my heavy leather boots crunching against the pristine gravel. The massive ballroom doors stood wide open, spilling warm golden light and the soft, elegant melodies of a live string quartet onto the manicured lawns. Inside, 500 guests drifted beneath massive crystal chandeliers that fractured the light into thousands of glittering shards. Women were draped in heavy silk and sparkling jewels, while men stood rigidly in tailored tuxedos that cost more than most working families earned in an entire year. The air inside the hall was thick with the overwhelming scent of expensive perfume and imported orchids. Waiters in pristine uniforms glided silently across the floor, carrying silver trays loaded with crystal champagne flutes and delicate appetizers. It was a sea of calculated wealth, a highly choreographed social performance where every interaction was carefully measured in net worth and social leverage. I stepped into the foyer, holding the simple, hand-carved wooden box that contained my wedding gift for my son, Matthew, and his bride, Natalie. I did not belong in this world of hollow opulence, but I was a father attending his only child's wedding. I expected basic human decency. I expected to see my son smile when I walked into the room. I navigated the edges of the crowded ballroom, keeping a respectful distance from the dancing couples, making my way toward the designated family enclave near the main stage. The tables in this VIP section were adorned with towering centerpieces of rare white roses and heavy silver cutlery. I saw Matthew standing near the head table, laughing with a group of young men I did not recognize. He looked handsome in his fitted tuxedo, but his smile seemed rehearsed, tight, and unnatural around the edges. I took another step forward, feeling a brief surge of parental pride, entirely unaware that a vicious trap was already closing around me. Before I could reach my son, a solid wall of custom Italian fabric blocked my path. Howard Montgomery, Natalie's father, stepped directly in front of me. He was a large, imposing man, his face flushed with champagne and an inherent sense of superiority. He smelled aggressively of heavy cologne and expensive cigars. Beside him stood his wife, Diane, a woman whose face was pulled tight into a mask of permanent disdain. She wore a heavy diamond necklace that caught the chandelier light, her eyes narrowing as they swept over my modest suit. Howard planted his feet firmly, crossing his arms over his broad chest. His voice, booming and completely devoid of warmth, easily carried over the elegant music. He demanded to know what I thought I was doing walking into the VIP section. He stated with absolute arrogance that this area was strictly reserved for the bridal family and the primary financial sponsors of the evening. I kept my voice perfectly level, gripping the wooden box in my hands. I reminded him that I was the groom's father and that I belonged at the family table. Diane scoffed loudly, a harsh sound that immediately drew the attention of dozens of nearby guests. She took a deliberate step forward, aggressively invading my personal space. She announced to the surrounding crowd that I was completely delusional. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at my chest, criticizing my worn clothing and the heavy boots I wore. She stated loudly that her family had spent $500,000 to ensure this wedding was the social event of the season, and my pathetic presence was a direct insult to their massive investment. The guests nearest to us stopped talking. The polite clinking of crystal glasses ceased entirely. A heavy, intensely uncomfortable silence began to spread outward from our confrontation, like ripples in a dark pond. Howard leaned in closer, his breath sour with alcohol and malice. He told me that my designated seat was at table 42, located near the kitchen doors, sitting alongside the event photographers and the catering staff. I refused to move a single inch. I looked Howard directly in the eyes and stated that I would not be hidden away like a shameful family secret. Diane's face twisted with sudden, vicious anger. She reached into her sequined clutch purse and pulled out a crisp $50 bill. She shoved it violently against my chest, the paper fluttering down to land on the polished marble floor directly between my boots. She raised her voice even higher, ensuring that at least 200 people heard her next words with absolute clarity. She declared that I was not a father, but simply an impoverished burden who had absolutely nothing to offer her daughter's prestigious new life. She called me trash. She instructed me to take the money, call a cheap cab, and leave the estate immediately before I humiliated Matthew any further. The sheer cruelty of the moment hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute and deafening. Hundreds of eyes bored into me, waiting for my reaction. Some guests looked away with mild discomfort, while others watched with naked, cruel amusement. But I did not care about the guests. I did not care about Howard's aggressive posturing or Diane's venomous insults. My attention shifted entirely to the head table. I looked past the hostile wall of my new in-laws and locked eyes directly with my son. Matthew was standing exactly where he had been a moment ago, a mere 15 feet away. He had heard every single word of the exchange. He had seen the money flutter to the floor in an act of ultimate disrespect. He had watched these people publicly strip his father of all dignity. This was the boy I had raised alone after his mother died. This was the boy I had stayed up with during childhood fevers. The boy whose education I had secured with years of quiet labor. The boy who had once looked at me with absolute trust and love. I waited. I waited for the man I raised to step forward and prove his character. I waited for him to push Howard aside, to demand basic respect for his father, to defend our family name against this unprovoked attack. I waited for just a simple word of objection. Matthew's face flushed a deep, embarrassed crimson. His hands trembled slightly at his sides. He looked at me, then looked at the furious, demanding face of his new father-in-law. Then, very slowly, Matthew lowered his head. He reached up, intensely pretending to adjust his designer cufflinks. He shifted his weight, turned his shoulder away from me, and looked down at the expensive silk table runner. He chose them. He chose the illusion of their wealth and the promise of their elite social status over the man who gave him life. He accepted my public execution because it was far more convenient than standing up for the truth. The betrayal did not hit me with a sudden burst of screaming anger. It settled into my chest like a block of solid ice. It was a profound, chilling clarity that changed everything. My son was gone, replaced by a coward who had been easily bought with imported champagne and false promises. I did not yell. I did not stoop to retrieve the crumpled $50 bill from the marble floor. I adjusted the lapels of my dark wool suit with slow, deliberate precision. I looked at the hand-carved wooden box in my hands, a gift that now felt entirely meaningless, and placed it quietly on a nearby cocktail table. I turned my back on Howard and Diane and began to walk toward the massive oak doors of the ballroom exit. Suddenly, a hand grabbed my forearm. It was Matthew. The optics of the groom's father walking out before the first course was even served was a massive social scandal the Montgomery family had not calculated. Matthew squeezed my arm tightly, his voice a frantic, hissing whisper meant only for me. He begged me not to go. He told me to stop making a scene and to just go sit in the back so the photographers could finish the scheduled family portraits without having to answer awkward questions from the guests. I looked down at his hand gripping my sleeve. The desperation in his grip was pathetic and revealing. I let the silence stretch until he became profoundly uncomfortable and slowly released me. I turned to face my son, Howard, and Diane, ensuring my posture was perfectly straight and commanding. I spoke in a voice that was neither loud nor angry, yet it sliced through the dead silence of the massive room with absolute, undeniable authority. I told them that they looked at me and saw a poor old man. I told them they saw a worn suit and a rusted truck. But I informed them that what they did not see was the signature on the master deed to this entire estate. I looked directly into Howard's suddenly pale, shocked face and told him that he did not see the name of the venture capital firm that currently held the massive, highly leveraged note on his sprawling luxury house. I stated, clearly and firmly, that I was actually a billionaire. I did not wait for their reaction. I did not wait for the confusion to morph into terror. I stepped over the $50 bill, turned my back on my son for the last time, and walked out of the Oakhaven estate. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind me, sealing them inside the quiet tomb of their own arrogance. They assumed it was the pathetic, desperate bluff of a broken old man trying to save face. They were completely unaware that they had just activated a financial death sentence that would systematically dismantle every single aspect of their privileged lives. I learned the precise details of what happened after the heavy oak doors closed behind me from the venue staff I employed. Inside the grand ballroom, the suffocating silence held for only a handful of seconds before Howard Montgomery took absolute control of the narrative. He let out a loud, booming laugh that deliberately echoed off the vaulted ceilings. He raised his imported crystal glass of champagne high into the air and loudly announced to the stunned crowd that advanced age was a terrible thief of the human mind. He confidently dismissed my final words as the sad, pathetic delusions of a senile old man who had forgotten to take his daily medication. He told his wealthy peers that it was a tragedy to witness such mental decline, expertly spinning his cruel behavior into an act of supposed patience and charity. Diane immediately joined his calculated performance. She frantically signaled the string quartet to resume playing an upbeat symphony and urged the surrounding guests to return to their expensive catered meals. She moved through the affluent crowd with a practiced artificial smile pasted across her face. She touched the arms of the most influential attendees, whispering false assurances that my outburst was just a tragic display of long-term dementia. The high society guests were eager to avoid any genuine human discomfort or scandal. They readily accepted the convenient lie Diane offered them. The polite clinking of heavy silver cutlery against fine porcelain plates quickly resumed. The false reality of the Montgomery family was seamlessly and completely restored. Natalie, the radiant bride, did not spare a single thought or shed a single tear for the father-in-law who had just been banished from her perfect evening. She swept across the polished marble dance floor in her heavy custom gown, completely absorbed in the illusion of her own absolute importance. Howard pulled a group of his wealthy business associates toward the private bar area. He spent the next 2 hours aggressively bragging about his latest luxury import acquisitions. He loudly mocked my rusted truck and my faded wool suit to anyone who would listen to his booming voice. He told his associates that he was doing my son a massive favor by rescuing him from a pathetic lifetime of blue-collar poverty. Howard genuinely believed he had won a decisive and permanent victory. He thought he had successfully excised a malignant embarrassment from their flawless social circle. He was completely blinded by his own massive ego, entirely unaware that the financial ground beneath his expensive leather shoes was already beginning to crumble. While the Montgomery family loudly celebrated their perceived dominance, my son retreated to the darkest corner of the massive ballroom. Matthew did not join the dancing or the laughter. He did not mingle with the influential politicians and business owners his new wife was so desperate to impress. Instead, he stationed himself directly next to the open bar. He ordered glass after glass of the most expensive whiskey available, pouring the burning amber liquid down his throat with a desperate, frantic rhythm. He was actively trying to drown the fresh memory of the crumpled $50 bill fluttering to the floor. He was trying to violently silence the quiet voice in his head that told him he had just sold his soul for a seat at a table where he would never truly be respected. The expensive alcohol did not bring my son any peace. It only amplified his pathetic cowardice and deep internal shame. Every time a smiling guest approached to congratulate him on his beautiful wedding, his practiced smile fractured a little more. His hands shook slightly as he gripped his glass. He was a hollow man wearing a fitted tuxedo, secretly terrified that my parting words about being a billionaire might actually be true. As the night wore on, the extravagance of the wedding escalated into pure financial gluttony. Cases of vintage champagne were opened and recklessly poured into towering crystal pyramids. Howard and Diane stood at the very center of the ballroom, happily accepting the adoration and envy of their shallow peers. They had successfully bullied a poor old man into submission, and their world had rewarded them with applause. They slept very soundly that night, wrapped in expensive imported sheets, entirely oblivious to the absolute destruction I had already set in motion. The morning sun crept through the simple cotton curtains of my kitchen, exactly the same way it had for the last 30 years. I sat at my worn oak table with a mug of black coffee. The house was completely silent. There were no valets. There were no catering staff. There was only the gentle hum of my old refrigerator and the familiar ticking of the wall clock. Outside my window, my rusted 1998 Ford pickup truck sat in the driveway. To the Montgomery family, that truck was a symbol of my failure. They did not know that I kept that exact truck as a daily reminder of where I started. 40 years ago, I did not have a sprawling estate or a massive corporate portfolio. I had one used delivery truck with a failing transmission and a newborn son sleeping in a crib. I worked 18-hour shifts driving cargo across state lines while my late wife managed our meager finances from a spiral notebook on this very kitchen table. We built our life brick by brick. When I bought my second truck, it felt like a triumph. When I bought my first small warehouse near the shipping docks, it was the culmination of a decade of relentless labor. From that single warehouse, I slowly built Foster Holdings. I expanded into regional logistics, securing exclusive contracts with major shipping lines. When the logistics empire generated excess capital, I quietly moved into commercial real estate. I bought the land the warehouses sat on. I bought the ports. I bought the massive commercial plots that the city developers desperately needed. Over 4 decades, I accumulated billions of dollars in assets. But I never changed my zip code. I never bought a mansion. I never traded my quiet life for a seat at the high society table. I kept my wealth hidden for a very specific reason. When my wife passed away, I looked around at the affluent circles we occasionally brushed against. I saw what massive unearned wealth did to the children of my business partners. I watched trust funds turn bright young men into lazy, entitled adults who believed the world owed them absolute obedience. I refused to let that happen to Matthew. I wanted him to understand the weight of a dollar, I wanted him to experience the profound dignity of earning his own way in the world. I paid for his education in full so he would never start life in debt. But after graduation, I closed the bank entirely. I told him he had to build his own career. I wanted to give him the greatest gift a father could offer, which is the opportunity to forge his own character through genuine struggle. It was a test. I needed to see what kind of man he would become when he thought no one was going to catch him if he fell. I truly believed he was navigating his own path until he met Natalie Montgomery. Her family was a black hole of luxury and status. They demanded expensive dinners, exotic vacations, and high society events. Matthew desperately tried to keep up with their reckless spending to prove he was worthy of their daughter. He drained his savings. He maxed out his credit. He foolishly tried to play a game he could not afford. I knew all of this because my corporate accountants flagged his financial distress. I watched silently as he drowned himself in debt to impress people who fundamentally despised him. The ultimate betrayal did not actually start with the $50 bill on the ballroom floor. It started exactly 5 days before the wedding. Matthew had signed a binding contract for the lavish catering at the Oakhaven estate. It was a bill for $80,000 just for the food and the imported champagne. When the catering company tried to process his final payment, his credit cards were completely declined. The bank rejected his requests for an emergency extension. The wedding was entirely on the verge of being canceled due to his lack of funds. Matthew was terrified of telling the Montgomery family that he was broke. He did not come to me for help. He was too ashamed of his failure. So I stepped in. I did not want my son to face the ultimate humiliation on what was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. I contacted the catering company through a proxy. I completely paid off the $80,000 invoice in cash. I swore the venue management to absolute secrecy. I saved the entire wedding, and I never asked for a single word of gratitude. I sat in the background and let Matthew pretend he was a success. I gave him the ultimate silent gift, hoping that eventually he would realize the value of true unconditional love. Instead, he stood by and watched his new family humiliate me. He allowed his new mother-in-law to throw a $50 bill at the man who had secretly paid $80,000 just so her wealthy friends could drink vintage champagne. He chose to protect his fragile ego instead of defending the father who had literally bought the ground he was standing on. I finished my coffee and placed the empty mug in the sink. The sadness in my chest was completely gone now. It was replaced by a cold, mechanical resolve. My son had failed the final test. He had proven his character, and the results were unacceptable. He wanted to live in the ruthless world of the Montgomery family, where money was the only language that mattered. It was time to show them all that I spoke that language better than anyone else alive. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct line to my corporate attorney. The time for silent observation was over. The time for the adjustment had officially begun. The morning after the wedding began with a severe hangover for the Montgomery family. Despite the headache, Howard Montgomery was riding a wave of absolute euphoria. He genuinely believed he had cemented his status at the very top of the social hierarchy. At exactly 10 in the morning, he drove his leased silver Mercedes down the long paved driveway of the Oakhaven estate. He was returning to the scene of his perceived triumph to settle the final venue invoice of $150,000. He strutted through the heavy glass doors of the administrative office with the unearned confidence of a conquering king. The venue manager, meticulous professional named Samuel, reported every single detail of this encounter directly to me. Howard did not wait to be invited into the private office. He simply pushed the mahogany door open and dropped his heavy leather briefcase onto the polished desk. He demanded a cup of imported espresso from the receptionist without bothering to look in her direction. He settled his large frame into the plush leather guest chair, crossing his legs and checking his gold watch. He expected absolute deference. He anticipated that the venue staff would spend the next 20 minutes showering him with praise for hosting the most extravagant event of the season. He smiled a wide, arrogant smile, fully prepared to bask in the glow of his own financial power. Samuel sat quietly across from him. He did not offer praise. He did not ask the receptionist to fetch the espresso. He simply opened a thick gray folder and placed his hands flat on the desk. Howard failed to notice the sudden drop in temperature in the room. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a heavy platinum corporate credit card. He tossed the card onto the center of the desk with a loud metallic clatter. He instructed Samuel to run the card for the final balance of $150,000. He loudly bragged that the party was a massive success, especially after they had successfully removed the trash that tried to ruin the evening. He laughed at his own cruel joke, fully expecting Samuel to join in. Samuel did not laugh. He looked down at the platinum card and then looked directly into the flushed face of Howard. The silence in the office stretched out, becoming thick and incredibly uncomfortable. Howard shifted in his chair, his arrogant smile faltering slightly. He tapped his fingers on the armrest and told Samuel to hurry up because he had a very important lunch meeting with international investors. He was entirely unaware that his corporate card was tied to a rapidly collapsing line of credit. He had financed the entire wedding on business debt illegally, using his company funds to pay for personal luxury. He was also completely unaware that the payment protocol for the Oakhaven estate had been drastically altered at 6 a.m. under my direct orders. Howard leaned forward, his patience wearing incredibly thin. He demanded to know if there was a problem with the credit machine. He arrogantly suggested that perhaps the venue was simply not accustomed to processing such massive transactions all at once. He offered to call his private banker to authorize the charge manually. He desperately clung to the illusion that he was the most important man in the room. He believed that his money bought him the right to treat everyone around him as temporary servants. Samuel maintained his perfect professional composure. He did not touch the platinum card sitting on his desk. Instead, he slowly slid a single piece of heavy paper across the polished wood toward Howard. It was not a receipt. It was not a standard final invoice. Howard stared at the document with a growing sense of confusion. He reached out and picked it up, his eyes scanning the bold black letters printed at the very top of the page. The document was a formal legal notice of default and seizure. Howard scoffed loudly, waving the paper in the air. He told Samuel that there had been a ridiculous clerical error. He loudly insisted that his credit was absolutely flawless and that his business accounts held millions of dollars in reserve. He ordered Samuel to stop playing stupid administrative games and just run the card so he could leave. He still thought he was in control. He still thought his loud voice and expensive suit could bully reality into bending to his will. He was about to learn that true power does not need to shout. True power simply locks the door and waits for the oxygen to run out. Howard stared at the bold black letters printed on the legal document. He blinked several times completely, refusing to comprehend the words on the page. He scoffed loudly and threw the heavy paper back onto the polished mahogany desk. He told Samuel that this was clearly a ridiculous administrative mistake. He demanded that the venue manager stop playing stupid games and process the $150,000 charge immediately so he could leave. Samuel did not flinch. He did not reach for the platinum credit card. He spoke in a perfectly modulated professional tone that completely lacked any warmth or subservience. He informed Howard that the credit card had not been declined by the banking institution. It had been intentionally and permanently rejected by the estate administration. He explained that as of 6 o'clock that morning, the venue had initiated a full financial lockdown on the Montgomery family account. Howard leaned forward in his chair. His face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. He raised his voice, shouting that he was a highly respected businessman and that absolutely nobody rejected his money. He threatened to ruin the pristine reputation of the Oakhaven estate. He threatened to call the police and have Samuel arrested for fraud. Samuel simply opened the thick gray folder wider. He pulled out a stack of high-resolution color photographs and laid them carefully across the desk. The photographs meticulously documented the physical aftermath of the wedding reception. They showed shattered imported crystal glasses smashed into the antique ballroom floor. They showed deep, ugly burn marks on the historic silk curtains from illegally smoked cigars. They showed heavy gouges in the vintage mahogany doors, where the catering equipment had been violently shoved out of the way by reckless guests. Samuel explained that the guests of the Montgomery family had caused over $40,000 in physical damage to a registered historical property. Furthermore, Samuel cited a specific morality and conduct clause buried deeply within the massive rental contract that Howard had hastily signed without reading. Samuel stated that multiple venue staff members had witnessed Howard and his wife publicly humiliating an elderly guest. The staff had reported the verbal abuse and the act of aggressively throwing money onto the floor. Samuel explained that this deliberate and cruel behavior was a direct violation of the estate conduct policy, triggering an immediate and unappealable breach of contract. Howard dismissed the extensive property damage as minor wear and tear. He shouted that he would simply write a separate business check to cover the broken glasses and the scratched doors. He demanded that Samuel immediately release the wedding gifts. Howard proudly mentioned that there were dozens of extremely valuable imported presents, including rare artwork and solid silver table settings currently locked in the venue holding room. He stated forcefully that he was collecting his daughter's expensive gifts and leaving the property. Samuel shook his head slowly. He folded his hands precisely over the legal document. He informed Howard that the expensive gifts were no longer the property of the Montgomery family. Under the specific terms of the default clause, all physical items brought onto the estate by the hosting party were now legally seized as collateral. Samuel explained that the items would remain locked away until the full cost of the property damage and the outstanding invoice were settled in a federal court of law. He noted that the private security team had already placed a heavy steel padlock on the holding room doors. The grim reality of the situation finally began to penetrate Howard's thick armor of arrogance. The seized gifts were worth tens of thousands of dollars, but more importantly, they were highly visible status symbols. If the high society guests discovered their lavish presents had been confiscated because the Montgomery family defaulted on a venue bill, the social humiliation would be absolute and permanent. Howard knew his entire business empire relied on the illusion of infinite wealth. If his investors heard about this failure, his creditors would immediately begin to circle like starving wolves. Howard slammed his heavy fist down on the polished wood desk. He demanded the immediate release of the collateral, shouting that holding the gifts was outright theft. Samuel remained entirely unmoved by the aggressive physical display. He delivered the final calculated blow with cold, clinical efficiency. He handed Howard a secondary piece of heavy paper. It was a formal and legally binding trespass warning. Samuel stated clearly that effective immediately, Howard, his wife, his daughter, and every single member of their extended family were permanently banned from stepping foot on the Oak Haven estate. He warned Howard that if his leased silver Mercedes was not removed from the private driveway within 3 minutes, the armed estate security team would physically drag him off the premises and have him formally arrested for criminal trespassing. The illusion of Howard's absolute control had been completely shattered by a calm man sitting behind a desk. He realized with sudden, terrifying panic that his loud voice held absolutely no authority in this room. Howard stood frozen in front of the heavy mahogany desk. The trespass warning in his hand trembled slightly. His brain desperately tried to process the catastrophic shift in power. For a man who had built his entire existence on intimidation and financial leverage, the sudden complete loss of control was terrifying. He relied on his only remaining weapon, which was the threat of ruinous litigation. He crumpled the trespass warning into a tight ball and threw it onto the polished wood floor. He leaned over the desk, his face pale and sweating. He told Samuel that this was an illegal seizure of assets. He shouted that he retained the most aggressive corporate lawyers in the state. He promised to drag the Oakhaven estate through years of agonizing legal battles until the property was completely bankrupt. He demanded the full legal name of the estate owner. He wanted the name of the man hiding behind the administrative desk. He yelled that he was going to personally sue the owner for defamation, breach of contract, and grand larceny. He demanded to know exactly who he was dealing with so his legal team could begin drafting the lawsuit immediately. Samuel did not blink. He did not show a single trace of intimidation. He calmly reached into the top drawer of his desk. He pulled out a thick, matte black business card embossed with heavy silver lettering. He placed the card perfectly in the center of the desk, directly in front of Howard. Samuel suggested that Howard should indeed contact his legal team as soon as possible. He stated that the owner of the Oakhaven estate was fully prepared for any litigation the Montgomery family wished to pursue. Howard snatched the heavy black card off the desk with a vicious swipe of his hand. He looked down at the silver lettering, expecting to see the name of an anonymous real estate conglomerate or a distant foreign investor. Instead, his eyes locked onto two simple words printed directly beneath the corporate crest of Foster Holdings, Chief Executive Officer Mitchell Foster. All the blood instantly drained from Howard Montgomery's face. His breathing completely stopped. The opulent walls of the administrative office seemed to violently close in on him. His mind flashed back to the grand ballroom the night before. He saw my worn wool suit. He saw my rusted 1998 pickup truck parked in the service lot. He heard his own loud voice mocking the man he called trash. He saw his wife throwing a $50 bill onto the marble floor. And then with horrifying clarity he remembered my final calm words before the heavy oak doors closed. "You see a poor old man, but I am actually a billionaire." The crushing weight of his catastrophic mistake hit him with the physical force of a freight train. He had not just insulted a poor wedding guest. He had publicly humiliated and deeply antagonized the sole owner of a massive corporate empire. He had threatened the very man who legally controlled the ground his daughter was married on, and who now held tens of thousands of dollars of their social capital hostage. Howard staggered backward away from the desk. The black business card felt like a burning coal in his hand. He opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no words came out. There was no more arrogant shouting. There were no more empty legal threats. There was only the absolute suffocating terror of a man who suddenly realizes he has eagerly walked directly into his own financial execution. Howard Montgomery drove his leased silver luxury car back to his sprawling estate in a state of absolute blind panic. He ignored every speed limit and traffic signal in his wealthy neighborhood. He barely noticed the horrible scraping sound when he dragged his expensive alloy wheels against the stone curb of his own pristine driveway. He threw the car into park and burst through the heavy double front doors of his mansion, breathing heavily and sweating through his custom-tailored shirt. The sudden violent noise echoed through the quiet house. Diane and Natalie were sitting comfortably in the formal living room, completely unaware of the impending disaster. They were casually drinking imported sparkling water and eagerly discussing the itinerary for the upcoming luxury honeymoon to Paris. They looked up in sheer shock as Howard collapsed heavily into a plush armchair, clutching his chest. He looked exactly like a man who had just seen his own grave. Diane immediately stood up and asked him what was wrong, fully expecting him to complain about a minor inconvenience with the venue billing department. Howard could barely form the necessary words. His voice was a weak, trembling rasp, entirely stripped of its usual booming arrogance. He told his wife and daughter that the estate administration had rejected his corporate credit card. He told them that all of the expensive imported wedding gifts were securely locked inside a holding room and legally confiscated as collateral for the massive unpaid balance. Diane dropped her crystal glass in pure shock. It shattered violently against the expensive Persian rug, but nobody moved to clean it up. She immediately went on the defensive, resorting to her usual tactic of blaming the working class. She loudly accused the venue staff of being completely incompetent and lazy. She insisted that their corporate bank accounts were perfectly fine, and that this situation was simply a ridiculous administrative error made by foolish employees. Howard shook his head violently, his face pale and slick with cold sweat. He looked at his wife and his newly married daughter with wide, terrified eyes. He told them it was not an error. He explained with a trembling voice that the entire Montgomery family was now permanently banned from the estate property under the threat of immediate criminal arrest. Natalie scoffed loudly at this revelation. She stood up and crossed her arms entirely, refusing to accept this new restrictive reality. She demanded to know who possessed the absolute audacity to ban her family from a public event space. Howard took a deep, agonizing breath. He looked directly at his beautiful, entitled daughter and told her the horrifying truth. He told her that the luxury estate was not a public venue. It was a private commercial asset, wholly owned by a massive corporate entity called Foster Holdings. He watched the utter confusion wash over his family as he slowly revealed the name of the chief executive officer. He told them the sole owner was Mitchell Foster. The opulent, formal living room fell completely dead silent. Diane stared at her husband as if he had entirely lost his mind. Natalie let out a sharp, cruel laugh that betrayed her growing internal panic. She told her father he was being completely ridiculous and gullible. She aggressively insisted that Matthew's father was nothing but a pathetic, impoverished old man who drove a rusted truck and wore cheap, off-the-rack clothes. She completely refused to believe that the quiet man they had publicly humiliated the night before possessed any actual wealth or true power. She desperately convinced herself that this entire situation was just an elaborate, sick prank. She decided that Mitchell must have somehow bribed or convinced the venue manager to play along with this ridiculous charade out of petty lower-class revenge. Natalie was entirely blinded by her own unearned sense of superiority and her deep hatred for anyone outside her social tax bracket. She snatched her expensive mobile phone from the glass coffee table, her manicured fingers trembling with absolute rage. She declared loudly to her parents that she was not going to let a jealous poor old man ruin the first day of her perfect marriage. She aggressively dialed my personal phone number fully, intending to verbally destroy me and demand the immediate return of her expensive crystal and silver wedding gifts. I was sitting comfortably in my quiet home study, carefully reviewing the morning financial reports when my mobile phone began to ring. I saw the name Natalie Montgomery flash brightly across the digital screen. I calmly answered the incoming call and placed the phone down on my solid wooden desk, engaging the speaker mode. I did not say hello or offer any formal greeting. I simply sat back and listened. Natalie immediately launched into a vicious, screaming tirade the moment the line connected. She called me a pathetic liar and a manipulative old fool. She demanded that I call the venue manager right that very second and cancel whatever stupid illegal prank I was trying to pull on her family. She yelled that if I did not release her wedding gifts immediately, she would have her wealthy father destroy me in a federal court of law. She screamed until her throat grew hoarse violently, threatening to make sure I never saw my son Matthew ever again. She fully expected me to argue with her. She expected me to shout back or try to weakly defend my actions. She expected a loud, dramatic fight because her entire privileged life was built on aggressive conflict and bullying people into submission. I listened to her breathe heavily on the other end of the open line, waiting for my frightened response. I did not give her a single word of satisfaction. I did not offer an explanation or issue a counter-threat. I slowly reached out and gently tapped the red button on the screen, abruptly ending the call. I then immediately blocked her number from my device. The absolute silence that followed was my ultimate weapon. I knew perfectly well that my complete refusal to engage would shatter her fragile illusion of control far more effectively than any screaming match ever could. I left her standing in her massive living room, holding a dead piece of plastic, slowly realizing that she was completely powerless against a quiet man she could no longer bully. The atmosphere inside the executive suite of Foster Holdings was the exact opposite of the chaotic screaming currently taking place inside the Montgomery mansion. There was absolutely no panic here. There were no raised voices or desperate threats. My corner office, located on the 50th floor of the glass and steel tower, was a sanctuary of absolute silence and clinical precision. The thick, soundproof windows completely blocked out the noise of the city below. I stood by the glass, looking down at the tiny vehicles moving through the streets while I waited for my corporate counsel to arrive. I had spent 40 years building an empire that operated silently in the background of the global economy. Today, I was going to use that massive, invisible machine to crush a single arrogant man. The heavy mahogany doors of my office swung open, and Gordon Reed walked into the room. Gordon was 60 years old and possessed the sharp, calculating demeanor of a predatory bird. He was not just an attorney. He was the chief architect of my corporate defense strategy. He did not ask about my emotional state. He did not offer any meaningless sympathies regarding my son's terrible behavior at the wedding. Gordon knew exactly why he had been summoned on a weekend. He walked directly to the massive conference table situated in the center of the room and placed a thick black leather briefcase onto the polished surface. He popped the brass latches and began extracting thick stacks of financial dossiers, spreading them out with methodical care. I turned away from the window and took my seat at the head of the long table. I looked at the files. Gordon folded his hands and began the briefing. He stated that he had spent the last 4 hours conducting a comprehensive forensic audit of Howard Montgomery and his entire business operation. The results were exactly as I had suspected. Gordon explained that the Montgomery family projected an image of generational wealth, but their actual financial reality was a completely unstable house of cards. They possessed virtually no liquid assets. Their luxury import business was built entirely on massive amounts of highly leveraged debt. They used commercial loans to finance their lavish personal lifestyle, constantly moving money between accounts to maintain the fragile illusion of extreme wealth. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. I instructed Gordon that I did not want to destroy them illegally. I wanted to dismantle them using the exact same financial systems they used to oppress others. I told him we were going to systematically locate and sever every single lifeline keeping their fraudulent empire afloat. Gordon nodded, his expression completely neutral. He tapped the first dossier on the table. He explained that Howard Montgomery's entire import business relied on 3 massive shipping warehouses located at the southern commercial port. These warehouses held millions of dollars of imported luxury inventory waiting to be distributed to high-end retailers. Howard did not own these buildings. He leased them on a 10-year commercial contract. Gordon looked up and informed me that Foster Holdings had quietly acquired the parent company that owned that specific commercial real estate portfolio 7 years ago. Howard had been paying his monthly rent directly into my corporate accounts without ever realizing it. I asked Gordon to identify a legal mechanism to immediately terminate that lease. Gordon slid a highlighted document across the table. It was a copy of the master rental agreement. He pointed to a specific standard commercial clause regarding morality and public reputation. Gordon explained that because the Oak Haven estate was also a subsidiary of Foster Holdings, the documented property damage and the formal police trespass warning issued to Howard constituted a direct violation of the broader corporate morality clause. Gordon stated that we had the absolute legal right to lock down the port warehouses immediately, pending a full review of his commercial fitness. I ordered Gordon to dispatch the private corporate security teams to the southern port. I instructed him to change every single padlock on the massive steel doors and to freeze all of Howard's inventory. When Howard's fleet of delivery trucks arrived on Monday morning, they would find themselves entirely locked out of their own business. Gordon moved swiftly to the next target. He opened a blue folder containing Howard's banking records. Gordon explained that Howard's company survived purely on a massive revolving line of credit provided by a regional institution named First National Commerce. Howard used this credit line to pay his international suppliers and to meet his massive weekly payroll. Gordon looked at me and stated the brilliant, devastating truth. Foster Holdings, through our venture capital wing, was the primary liquidity provider for First National Commerce. We essentially funded the bank that funded Howard. I instructed Gordon to place a direct phone call to the president of the bank. I told Gordon to formally flag the Montgomery corporate accounts as a highly toxic asset. I explained that once the bank realized their primary investor viewed Howard as a massive financial risk, they would panic. Gordon agreed entirely. He stated that the bank would immediately freeze Howard's revolving credit line to protect their own interests. They would issue an emergency demand for a comprehensive audit of his finances, effectively paralyzing his ability to spend a single dollar. He would not be able to pay his suppliers. He would not be able to pay his employees. The final dossier was the most personal. Gordon opened a thin red folder and spread out the property records for the massive luxury mansion where the Montgomery family currently lived. Gordon explained that Howard had been incredibly foolish. He had used the deed to his primary residence as collateral to secure the original business loans that started his failing import company. The moment his business defaulted on the massive debts caused by the frozen credit line, the bank would legally seize the house. I looked at the documents spread across the table. In less than 30 minutes, Gordon and I had completely mapped out the absolute destruction of a man who thought he ruled the world. There was no shouting. There were no dramatic insults thrown in a crowded ballroom. This was how true power operated. It was quiet. It was perfectly legal. It was absolutely merciless. I picked up a heavy gold pen from the desk. Gordon slid the necessary authorization forms across the polished wood. I signed my name with slow, deliberate strokes, formally authorizing the warehouse lockout and the banking intervention. I placed the pen down and looked at Gordon. The trap was completely set. The financial guillotine had been hoisted high into the air, and the rope had just been cut. We had systematically severed every single artery pumping money into the Montgomery family. By Monday morning, Howard would wake up and realize that the poor old man he had mocked and humiliated was the architect of his absolute ruin. I told Gordon to prepare for the inevitable fallout. I knew Howard would soon come begging for mercy, but I had absolutely none left to give. Monday morning arrived with a heavy blanket of gray fog rolling off the southern commercial port. Howard Montgomery woke up in his sprawling mansion, feeling a desperate need to reclaim his authority. The humiliating disaster at the Oakhaven estate over the weekend had left a bitter taste in his mouth. He desperately needed to return to his primary domain where he possessed absolute control. He needed to walk the floors of his massive import warehouses and watch hundreds of employees scramble to fulfill his orders. His entire luxury import business relied heavily on the Monday morning distribution schedule. Dozens of heavy transport trucks were scheduled to arrive at dawn to load millions of dollars of imported designer furniture, high-end electronics, and rare textiles. These goods were strictly promised to the most exclusive retailers across the country. Howard poured himself a cup of expensive black coffee and confidently prepared to start his week. Entirely convinced that his business empire was a completely separate entity from the personal humiliation he had suffered. He genuinely believed that his commercial power was entirely untouchable. At exactly 6 a.m, the first convoy of Montgomery Logistics transport trucks arrived at the massive steel gates of the Southern Port Distribution Center. The lead driver pulled his heavy vehicle up to the primary access point, fully expecting the automatic chain-link gates to slide open as they had done every single morning for the past 10 years. Instead, the gates remained firmly shut. The driver stepped out of his cabin into the damp morning air and walked toward the entrance. He immediately noticed that the familiar standard-issue Port Authority locks had been completely removed. In their place hung massive, heavy-duty steel padlocks secured by thick industrial chains. Behind the chained gates stood a line of 4 private corporate security contractors wearing dark tactical uniforms. They did not look like standard warehouse watchmen. They stood with their hands clasped behind their backs, projecting an aura of absolute unyielding authority. The confused truck driver approached the fence and loudly requested entry, stating that he had a tight delivery schedule to maintain. The lead security officer simply shook his head and calmly informed the driver that the facility was permanently locked down under the direct orders of the property owner. The driver panicked and immediately reached for his radio to call the dispatch office. Within 10 minutes, a massive line of idling transport trucks began to back up along the port access road, creating a massive logistical bottleneck. Howard received the frantic phone call from his warehouse manager while he was driving his silver Mercedes down the interstate. When he heard that his entire fleet was locked out of the primary distribution center, his face flushed with sudden violent anger. He assumed this was a pathetic bureaucratic mistake made by the local port authority. He pressed his foot heavily on the accelerator, pushing his luxury car to dangerous speeds. He was bleeding thousands of dollars for every single minute his trucks sat idle on the road. Howard arrived at the port 30 minutes later, his tires screeching as he pulled aggressively onto the gravel shoulder. He slammed his car door shut and marched directly toward the chained gates, his heavy leather shoes crunching loudly against the dirt. He ignored his confused employees and walked straight up to the private security officers. He began to shout immediately, resorting to his standard tactic of aggressive intimidation. He demanded that they remove the chains this very second. He yelled that he possessed an ironclad 10-year commercial lease on these 3 massive warehouses. He pointed a trembling finger at the massive steel buildings behind the fence and loudly declared that there was over $15 million of his personal inventory sitting inside those walls. He threatened to call the police and have the security guards arrested for unlawful corporate sabotage. He screamed that he was a highly powerful executive and that nobody had the right to disrupt his logistics network. The lead security officer allowed Howard to scream until he was completely out of breath. The officer did not flinch or reach for a weapon. He maintained a perfectly calm and clinical demeanor. When Howard finally stopped yelling, the officer reached into the interior pocket of his dark tactical jacket. He pulled out a heavy sealed legal envelope and slid it smoothly through the gaps in the chain-link fence. He instructed Howard to carefully read the enclosed document before making any more foolish legal threats. Howard snatched the envelope with trembling, angry hands. He tore open the paper seal and pulled out a thick stack of formal legal documents. The first page was a massive, bold notice of immediate lease termination and asset seizure. Howard aggressively scanned the dense legal text, his eyes searching for the specific reason for the lockout. He found the highlighted section referencing the exact morality and public conduct clause my attorney Gordon Reed had cited the day before. Howard scoffed loudly, refusing to understand how a public conduct clause could possibly apply to his private commercial lease. He angrily flipped to the final page of the document to find the signature of the property management company. Howard expected to see the familiar logo of the regional real estate trust he had been paying rent to such for the past 2 decades. Instead, he saw a completely different corporate seal. He stared at the bold black ink printed clearly at the bottom of the page. The parent company holding the master deed to the entire Southern Port Distribution Center was Foster Holdings. The authorized signature executing the immediate lockout and seizing the $15 million of inventory belonged to Mitchell Foster. Howard stood completely frozen on the damp gravel road. The heavy morning fog seemed to suddenly press down on him, suffocating his lungs. His massive transport trucks idled loudly behind him, coughing dark exhaust into the air, but he could no longer hear them. The absolute terror he had felt inside the venue administration office the day before returned with 10 times the force. It multiplied and expanded, tearing through his entire nervous system. He slowly looked up through the chain-link fence at the 3 massive steel warehouses. He realized with horrifying absolute clarity that he had spent the last 20 years paying rent directly to me. He had unknowingly built his entire arrogant luxury empire on land that I owned and controlled. I was not just a poor old man he could bully at a wedding. I was the silent architect of his entire commercial existence. His $15 million of imported luxury goods were now permanently locked inside my buildings, securely held hostage under a legally binding contract he had signed himself. He had absolutely no inventory to sell. He had no products to deliver to his angry exclusive retailers. His business was completely paralyzed. Howard Montgomery dropped the legal documents onto the wet gravel. He gripped the cold steel links of the locked gate with his shaking hands, realizing that his complete destruction had already been silently orchestrated long before he ever threw that $50 bill onto the ballroom floor. Howard stumbled away from the locked chain-link fence of the Southern Port Distribution Center. His breathing was shallow and ragged. He climbed back into his leased silver luxury car and locked the doors with trembling hands. The luxurious leather interior no longer felt like a symbol of his towering success. It felt exactly like a rapidly tightening cage. He gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned completely white against the dark leather. His mind raced through a dozen frantic scenarios, but every single path led to the same terrifying conclusion. He desperately needed a massive infusion of immediate liquid cash. He needed capital to hire an aggressive team of corporate litigators to break the lock on his warehouses. He needed money to rent temporary storage facilities and to somehow appease his furious retail clients who were currently waiting for their delayed luxury deliveries. He forced himself to take a deep breath and desperately tried to convince his panicked mind that this was merely a temporary cash flow problem. He had spent his entire adult life borrowing money to cover his terrible mistakes. He genuinely believed he could simply borrow his way out of this new trap. Howard drove directly from the shipping port to the main downtown branch of First National Commerce. This was the prestigious regional bank that held all of his personal and corporate accounts. It was the financial institution that had approved his massive revolving lines of credit for the past 15 years. He usually walked through the heavy glass doors and was immediately greeted by the branch manager with absolute deference. He was accustomed to being ushered into a private glass-walled office and offered premium coffee while the staff expedited his every financial request. Today, however, the atmosphere inside the massive marble lobby felt entirely different. Howard marched past the line of ordinary customers and approached the desk of the senior loan officer named Mr. Bradley. Howard did not wait to be politely acknowledged. He pulled out the plush leather guest chair and sat down heavily, demanding Bradley give him his immediate attention. Howard forced a wide, artificial smile onto his sweating face. He adopted his usual booming, confident tone, attempting to project the absolute authority he had completely lost at the port. He told Bradley that his luxury import business was expanding far more rapidly than he had initially anticipated. He lied smoothly, claiming that he had just secured a massive international shipping contract and needed a temporary commercial bridge loan of $2 million to cover the immediate logistical overhead. He casually waved his hand, insisting that the loan would be fully repaid within 60 days once his new exclusive inventory hit the retail floors. He sat back in the chair, fully expecting Bradley to immediately start printing the necessary approval forms. He expected the usual subservient nod and the unquestioning compliance his perceived wealth always commanded from the banking staff. Bradley did not smile back. The senior loan officer looked incredibly uncomfortable. He shifted nervously in his chair and adjusted his tie, deliberately avoiding Howard's demanding gaze. Bradley slowly opened his computer terminal and typed in the Montgomery corporate account numbers. He stared at the glowing screen for a long, painful moment. The silence in the small glass office grew thick and entirely suffocating. Howard felt a cold bead of sweat roll down the back of his neck. He loudly asked Bradley what the delay was, attributing the pause to a slow computer system. He arrogantly reminded the officer that he was one of the most important and wealthy clients in the entire building and that his time was incredibly valuable. Bradley finally looked up from the computer monitor. His face was entirely pale. He folded his hands carefully on the desk and spoke in a low, tight voice. He informed Howard that the bank could absolutely not approve the $2 million bridge loan. Howard immediately bristled, feeling his violent temper flare. He raised his voice, demanding to know why a measly $2 million was an issue for an account of his massive size. He threatened to move his entire corporate portfolio to a competing financial institution by the end of the afternoon if Bradley did not approve the cash transfer immediately. He leaned across the polished desk, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate the much smaller man. Bradley did not back down. Instead, he delivered the second devastating financial blow of the morning. He told Howard that transferring his portfolio to another bank was completely impossible. Bradley explained that as of 8 o'clock that very morning, the automated risk management system of the bank had completely frozen every single account tied to the Montgomery name. Howard completely stopped breathing. He stared at Bradley, unable to process the terrifying words. Bradley continued explaining that the corporate checking accounts, the personal savings accounts, and the massive revolving business credit lines were all entirely locked. Howard could not withdraw a single dollar. He could not write a check to pay his hundreds of employees. He could not access the funds needed to pay the massive monthly mortgage on his sprawling luxury mansion. He could not even buy a cup of coffee. He was completely severed from his own money. Howard erupted into a frantic panic. He slammed his fists down on the desk, shouting that this was a catastrophic error. He yelled that his credit history was absolutely flawless and that his import business generated millions of dollars in annual revenue. He demanded that Bradley override the computer system immediately. He screamed that they were ruining his life over a technical glitch. He ordered Bradley to call the bank president and have the financial freeze lifted before his entire import business completely collapsed. Bradley shook his head slowly. He explained that this was not a technical error, and it was completely beyond the authority of the local bank president to fix. Bradley lowered his voice, leaning forward, so the other customers in the lobby could not hear the humiliating details. He told Howard that First National Commerce was a respected regional bank, but it relied heavily on institutional venture capital to maintain its lending power. Bradley explained that the primary financial backer of the bank had initiated a massive portfolio review over the weekend. That massive institutional backer had manually flagged Howard's specific import business as a Level 1 toxic asset. Bradley outlined the brutal financial reality with cold, clinical precision. He explained that Howard's business model was incredibly high risk because it relied entirely on constant debt to generate the false illusion of profit. The institutional backer had recognized that Howard was using new loans to pay the interest on his old loans. The backer had issued a strict corporate directive to First National Commerce. The directive explicitly stated that if the bank extended one more single dollar of credit to the Montgomery family, the institutional backer would immediately withdraw hundreds of millions of dollars in funding from the bank itself. The bank had to choose between protecting Howard or protecting their own survival. They chose to cut Howard loose without a second thought to save themselves. Howard sat slumped in the leather chair, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his ruin. His mind raced frantically, trying to understand who possessed the immense power to intimidate an entire banking institution. He asked Bradley for the name of the venture capital firm. He desperately begged for the name of the institutional backer so he could go to their offices and plead for his commercial life. He promised to offer them a massive share of his company if they would just unlock his frozen accounts. Bradley turned his computer monitor around so it faced Howard directly. He pointed to the top of the internal banking directive displayed on the bright screen. Howard read the bold black letters printed at the head of the document. The institutional venture capital firm holding the massive financial strings of First National Commerce was Foster Capital, a direct subsidiary of Foster Holdings. Howard's eyes slowly tracked down the page, reading the specific merciless orders to destroy his credit limit. At the very bottom of the screen, he saw the digital authorization signature. It was the exact same signature he had seen on the lease termination document at the port earlier that morning. It was Mitchell Foster. Howard felt his entire world collapse inward. The air in the bank office became incredibly thin and impossible to breathe. He could not speak. He could not yell. The reality of his situation crushed the last remaining fragments of his arrogant ego. He was not just facing a temporary cash flow problem. He was entirely financially paralyzed. He had absolutely no inventory to sell. He had no credit to leverage. He had absolutely zero cash to survive. He realized with absolute horrifying certainty that the quiet elderly man he had mocked and humiliated at the wedding had entirely surrounded him. Mitchell had built invisible financial walls around Howard's entire life, and now those walls were rapidly closing in. Howard slowly stood up from the chair. His legs felt heavy and completely numb. He did not say another word to the loan officer. He turned and walked out of the glass office, moving like a hollow ghost. He stumbled through the bank lobby, completely ignoring the stares of the other customers. He pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the bright morning sunlight, a completely broken man. He had nothing left to leverage and absolutely nowhere left to run. I learned exactly how the Montgomery family imploded from the bitter and highly public divorce depositions that were filed only a few short weeks later. Howard Montgomery did not drive his leased silver luxury car back to his mansion with his usual aggressive speed. He navigated the affluent suburban streets with the slow, mechanical numbness of a condemned man walking toward the gallows. He pulled into the sweeping circular driveway and parked near the massive marble fountain. The water cascaded beautifully in the midday sun, projecting an image of absolute infinite wealth. Howard looked at his sprawling stone mansion and felt violently ill. He knew that the massive commercial bank would begin aggressive foreclosure proceedings by the end of the week. He stepped out of the car, his heavy leather shoes dragging across the pristine pavement. He opened the heavy double front doors and stepped into the grand foyer. The house was completely silent, except for the faint sound of the private chef preparing a gourmet lunch in the distant kitchen. Howard walked into the formal dining room, where his wife Diane and his daughter Natalie were inspecting color swatches for an upcoming expensive interior renovation. Diane looked up and immediately noticed the gray, ashen color of her husband's sweating face. She asked him if he had successfully secured the commercial bridge loan from the bank, expecting a simple, positive confirmation. Howard collapsed heavily into a custom-upholstered dining chair. He did not look at his wife. He stared blankly at the polished mahogany table and delivered the final fatal blow to their perfect high society illusion. He told them that there was absolutely no bridge loan. He told them that his massive luxury import business was completely paralyzed. He explained in a hollow, trembling voice that the bank had frozen every single corporate and personal account they possessed. He looked up at Diane with wide, terrified eyes and confessed that they had absolutely zero money to their name. Diane dropped the expensive fabric swatches onto the table. Her carefully crafted mask of aristocratic elegance completely shattered in an instant. She did not offer her terrified husband any comfort or emotional support. She immediately began to scream. Her voice was shrill and panicked, echoing terribly through the cavernous dining room. She demanded to know how this absolute disaster was mathematically possible. She yelled that they had massive social obligations and exclusive country club dues and a large staff of private servants to pay by Friday. Diane's mind raced through the immediate catastrophic social consequences. She realized with absolute horror that the prestigious charity gala she was supposed to chair next month would be completely impossible to fund. She thought about the other wealthy women at the country club who would circle like hungry vultures the moment they heard the Montgomery family had defaulted on their massive loans. She knew perfectly well that in their ruthless high society circle, sudden poverty was treated like a highly contagious disease. Anyone caught without money was instantly and permanently exiled. She looked at the expensive imported silk curtains and the rare antique vases decorating the room, knowing that they would all be seized by aggressive federal creditors within a matter of days. Howard buried his face in his trembling hands. He told her the terrifying truth he had learned at the bank. He explained that their primary venture capital backer was Foster Capital. He slowly repeated my name, confirming that the quiet man they had publicly humiliated completely controlled their entire financial existence. The news hit the room like a live explosive. The fragile illusion of their happy, wealthy family instantly vaporized. Diane viciously turned on Howard. The refined, high society matriarch disappeared entirely, replaced by a desperate, vulgar woman who realized she was about to lose her plastic crown. She accused Howard of being a complete financial failure. She screamed that he had lied to her for years about the true stability of his import business. She yelled that she completely refused to be dragged down into the working class because of his arrogant stupidity. Howard finally snapped back, his own absolute panic morphing into defensive rage. He stood up and shouted that she had spent thousands of dollars a week on useless luxury goods and designer clothes while he secretly drowned in corporate debt just to keep her from constantly complaining. The massive dining room became a vicious war zone of bitter accusations and deeply buried resentments. Their marriage had always been a simple, calculated business transaction, and now that the money was entirely gone, there was absolutely nothing left but pure venom. Natalie listened to her parents tear each other apart with growing absolute horror. She realized that her promised luxury honeymoon to Paris was completely canceled. She realized that the massive financial inheritance she had expected from her wealthy father was actually a mountain of toxic debt. She felt entirely cheated. She turned her furious gaze away from her screaming parents and marched directly up the grand, sweeping staircase. She found her new husband, Matthew, hiding in the master bedroom. Matthew was sitting on the edge of the plush mattress, staring at the floor, completely consumed by his own deep guilt over his cowardly silence at the wedding. Natalie did not offer him any wifely comfort. She kicked the heavy bedroom door shut with a violent slam that made Matthew jump in shock. Natalie stalked across the expensive carpet, her face twisted with pure, unadulterated rage. She stood over Matthew and began to verbally tear him to shreds. She called him a pathetic, weak idiot. She screamed that his father was a secret billionaire who owned half the city, and Matthew was entirely too stupid to even know about it. She blamed him for the entire catastrophic situation. She yelled that if Matthew had bothered to build a proper relationship with his father, the Montgomery family would not be facing total financial ruin. She accused him of deliberately hiding his massive generational wealth just to make her suffer. Matthew desperately tried to defend himself, his voice cracking with rising panic. He tried to explain that I had always lived a simple blue-collar life and had intentionally hidden the corporate money to teach him a lesson about hard work and personal responsibility. Natalie laughed, a harsh, cruel sound that completely lacked any warmth or humanity. She paced back and forth across the bedroom like a trapped wild animal. She screamed that she had wasted the best years of her youth, pretending to care about his boring, mediocre career aspirations. She yelled that she had only agreed to marry him because she assumed his father possessed some hidden retirement savings they could eventually drain. Finding out that the money was actually in the billions, and Matthew had completely failed to secure his rightful place as the sole corporate heir, was a profound betrayal she could not comprehend. She called him incredibly naive. She mocked his cheap, off-the-rack suits and his pathetic inability to command any respect from anyone in her social circle. She told him that a real man would have aggressively forced his father to hand over the corporate keys years ago instead of playing the role of a pathetic, grateful son. Matthew sat on the bed, completely absorbing the vicious verbal blows. The alcohol from the wedding reception still pounded heavily behind his eyes. He looked up at the beautiful woman he had solemnly promised to love and protect forever. He finally saw past her flawless makeup and her expensive designer clothes. He saw the cold, calculating financial greed that completely defined her entire existence. He realized that when she had watched her mother throw the $50 bill at me, she had not been embarrassed at all. She had fully supported the cruel action because she genuinely believed my perceived poverty made me completely worthless. Now that the financial roles were violently reversed, she was eagerly demanding that he weaponize his status as my son to steal the money she so desperately craved. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at his face and delivered a ruthless, absolute ultimatum. She told him that he had married into her elite family to provide her with a life of absolute luxury. She screamed that her parents were currently downstairs facing federal bankruptcy, and it was entirely his fault for letting them insult the man who secretly held all their massive debts. She ordered Matthew to get off the bed and go fix the massive disaster he had caused. She demanded that he drive directly to my modest suburban home right that very second. She told him to beg, cry, or successfully manipulate his way into securing his massive inheritance early so he could instantly bail out her failing family. She stated with cold, absolute certainty that if he returned to her mansion without a multi-million-dollar corporate check, he could pack his cheap bags and consider their 2-day-old marriage completely, permanently terminated. Matthew stared at his furious wife, finally realizing that she had never loved him for a single second. She had only ever loved the money he was supposed to provide, and now he had absolutely no choice but to face the father he had deeply betrayed. I was sitting on the wooden porch of my modest suburban home watching the afternoon sun filter through the old oak trees when the sleek black sports car violently swerved into my driveway. The expensive tires aggressively tore through the manicured grass near the brick mailbox, leaving deep, ugly, muddy trenches in the lawn. My son Matthew threw the vehicle into park and stormed out before the powerful engine even stopped running. He did not look like a happy newlywed returning from a joyful weekend. He looked exactly like a cornered animal desperate to escape a terrifying trap. He marched up the wooden steps, his expensive Italian leather shoes echoing loudly and disrespectfully against the timber. He did not knock on the front door. He did not offer a polite greeting or ask if I was available to speak. He simply stood over me, crossing his arms tightly over his chest, and glared down at me with absolute naked hostility. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee and waited. I had genuinely hoped that the terrifying reality of his new situation might have finally humbled him. I had deeply prayed that he would walk up those steps with genuine tears in his eyes, entirely ready to apologize for his pathetic, cowardly silence at the grand ballroom. I wanted my son to fall to his knees and ask for my forgiveness so we could begin the long, painful process of rebuilding our completely fractured relationship. Instead, I looked into his eyes and saw absolutely nothing but pure, selfish greed. He did not offer a single word of apology for the public humiliation I had endured. He did not ask how I was feeling or express any remorse for allowing his new mother-in-law to throw a $50 bill at my feet. He immediately launched into a vicious, aggressive tirade. He demanded to know what kind of sick, twisted psychological game I was playing with his new family. He yelled that he had just spent the last 2 hours dealing with a completely hysterical wife and a father-in-law who was entirely on the verge of a massive heart attack. He accused me of deliberately trying to ruin his perfect marriage out of petty jealousy. He paced back and forth across my quiet porch, aggressively waving his hands in the air. He shouted that locking the distribution warehouses and freezing the corporate bank accounts was a completely disproportionate and cruel response to a simple social misunderstanding. He actually referred to the vicious public abuse I suffered as a simple social misunderstanding. He claimed that Diane Montgomery was simply stressed about the massive event and that I should have been much more accommodating to her emotional needs. He actively blamed me for the entire incident, stating that my decision to wear an old suit was a deliberate, calculated provocation. He was completely blinded by his own frantic desperation and his absolute terror of losing Natalie. I placed my coffee mug down on the small wooden table next to my rocking chair. I looked at the boy I had raised completely alone and realized he was entirely gone. He had been completely consumed by the toxic, superficial world of the Montgomery family. Matthew stopped pacing and stood directly in front of me, leaning down to try and physically intimidate me. He lowered his voice into a harsh, demanding growl. He told me that he was absolutely done living in the shadows of my bizarre, secretive life. He stated that since I was apparently a secret billionaire, he was the absolute sole heir to the massive Foster Holdings corporate empire. He confidently declared that the billions of dollars I had spent my entire life building actually belonged to him by fundamental birthright. He did not view my wealth as a testament to 40 years of relentless hard labor. He simply viewed my money as his personal emergency rescue fund. Matthew demanded that I immediately write a certified corporate check for $10 million. He did not ask for a loan or beg for a favor. He aggressively demanded his inheritance early. He explained with absolute staggering arrogance that $10 million was simply pocket change for a man of my massive net worth. He yelled that he urgently needed the cash to completely bail out Howard Montgomery and save his wife's luxury import business from federal bankruptcy. He tried to justify his greedy demands by aggressively attacking my simple lifestyle. He pointed a trembling finger at my faded flannel shirt and my rusted 1998 pickup truck parked near the garage. He mocked my modest house and the simple wooden furniture on the porch. He claimed that I was completely pathetic because I possessed billions of dollars but still lived like an impoverished factory worker. He stated that I clearly did not know how to properly use or appreciate massive wealth. He told me that he and Natalie deserved the money because they actually knew how to exist in high society and could properly elevate the Foster family name among the global elite. I sat in my chair completely silent, absorbing every single disgusting word he threw at me. He was actively trying to weaponize his status as my only child. He genuinely believed that my deep parental love for him was a fatal weakness he could easily exploit. He thought I would gladly hand over millions of dollars just to buy back his affection and save his toxic marriage. He threatened me, claiming that if I did not immediately unlock the shipping warehouses and hand over the massive check, he would never speak to me again. He promised to permanently cut me out of his life and ensure I never saw my future grandchildren. He used the most sacred family bonds as cheap bargaining chips in a desperate financial negotiation. He proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that his soul was entirely corrupted. He was completely willing to drain my life, completely dry, just to appease a woman who fundamentally despised him. The sheer audacity of his demands was incredibly breathtaking. He stood there wearing the expensive tailored clothing I had indirectly paid for, demanding that I finance the very people who had treated me like absolute garbage. He wanted me to reward their cruelty with a massive financial bailout. He wanted me to validate his pathetic cowardice by handing him the keys to my corporate kingdom. He stared at me with wide, expectant eyes, breathing heavily from his aggressive shouting. He fully expected me to eventually break down and submit to his furious demands. He expected the poor old man to eagerly surrender to the loud demands of the arrogant prince. I did not raise my voice. I did not stand up or display any physical anger. The deep sorrow I had felt over the weekend was completely erased by his disgusting sense of entitlement. My mind shifted entirely from the role of a grieving father to the role of a ruthless corporate architect. I realized that saving my son was completely impossible because there was absolutely nothing left worth saving. He had chosen his path, and now he was going to experience the absolute devastating consequences of his own greedy actions. I looked at Matthew, maintaining perfect, unbroken eye contact. I told him to stop shouting on my porch and step inside the house. I told him we needed to have a very serious legal discussion regarding his assumed billionaire inheritance. Matthew smiled a quick, triumphant smirk, genuinely believing he had successfully bullied me into absolute submission. He aggressively pushed the front door open and strutted into my modest living room, completely unaware that he had just eagerly walked directly into the final, most devastating trap of his entire life. Matthew crossed the threshold of my home with the heavy, aggressive strides of a man who believed he had already won the war. He stood in the center of my modest living room, looking around at the simple woven rug and the old brick fireplace with absolute open disgust. He genuinely believed that his loud demands on the porch had successfully broken my spirit. He crossed his arms and impatiently tapped his expensive leather shoe against the hardwood floor, waiting for me to walk over to a desk and write him a massive corporate check. He expected me to desperately buy back his love and secure his disastrous marriage. I did not walk toward my desk. I walked calmly toward the hallway closet. I opened the door, moved a heavy box of winter coats aside, and unlocked the heavy iron safe bolted securely to the floorboards. I reached inside and pulled out a thick black leather binder containing hundreds of pages of dense legal text. I carried the heavy binder back into the living room and dropped it onto the center of the wooden coffee table with a loud, solid thud. Matthew looked at the binder, his arrogant expression faltering for a brief fraction of a second. He asked me what it was, his voice losing a tiny measure of its previous aggressive volume. He demanded to know why I was wasting his highly valuable time with paperwork when his wife was currently waiting for him to deliver the cash to save her failing family. I sat down on the simple fabric sofa and looked up at the man who was supposed to be my legacy. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I spoke with the cold, clinical precision of a corporate executioner. I told him to sit down and listen very carefully, because I was only going to explain his new financial reality exactly one time. Matthew hesitated, but the absolute authority in my voice forced him to slowly lower himself into the armchair opposite me. He stared at the black binder, his eyes darting back and forth, trying to understand the sudden massive shift in power dynamics. I placed my hand flat on the leather cover of the binder. I explained to Matthew that when his mother passed away, I made a solemn, unbreakable vow to her. I promised her that I would never allow the massive wealth I had accumulated to corrupt the soul of our only child. I told him that I had watched generational wealth completely destroy dozens of prominent families, turning bright, capable children into lazy, arrogant parasites who contributed absolutely nothing to society. I absolutely refused to let that happen to the Foster family name, so I built a legal fortress around the money. I explained that my entire corporate empire was not structured as a standard inheritance. It was secured within a highly complex, irrevocable blind trust. Matthew frowned, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. He arrogantly stated that a trust was just a simple legal tool to avoid paying inheritance taxes. He claimed it did not matter how the money was structured because he was my only living relative and therefore the sole legal beneficiary by default. He demanded that I stop trying to confuse him with legal terminology and just authorize the immediate release of the $10 million he desperately needed. I slowly shook my head, completely shattering his pathetic assumptions. I explained that a standard trust is given freely, but this specific blind trust was entirely conditional. I told Matthew that he was never guaranteed a single penny of my billions simply by accident of birth. The release of the massive corporate assets was strictly tied to a rigorous set of character and morality clauses. I explained that the trust was designed to remain completely locked until his 30th birthday, giving him enough time to prove he could build a life and a career based on his own merit. If he demonstrated genuine integrity, financial responsibility, and basic human decency, the trust would have automatically transferred the entire multi-billion-dollar empire into his name. He would have become one of the wealthiest men on the continent. Matthew stared at me, his mouth slightly open, as the sheer magnitude of what he had possessed slowly began to dawn on him. He realized that the incredible wealth his wife was currently screaming about had actually been his all along, waiting patiently in the shadows. He leaned forward, a hungry, desperate light filling his eyes. He aggressively stated that he was 28 years old and clearly responsible enough to handle the money right now. He demanded that I simply waive the age requirement and execute the immediate transfer so he could go save the Montgomery business. I opened the thick black binder and slowly turned the crisp white pages until I reached a specific section highlighted with a bright red legal tab. I looked directly into his desperate, greedy eyes. I told him that the age requirement was no longer a factor because the character clause had been permanently triggered over the weekend. I explained that the true test of a man's character is not how he behaves when everything is easy. The true test is how he acts when he is forced to choose between doing what is right and doing what is socially convenient. I recounted the exact events of the wedding reception with brutal, unyielding detail. I reminded him of the moment his new father-in-law blocked my path and loudly called me an embarrassment to my face. I reminded him of the exact moment his new mother-in-law threw a crumpled $50 bill onto the polished marble floor and viciously called me trash in front of 500 high society guests. I watched Matthew swallow hard, his face turning a sickly shade of pale gray as the memory of his own cowardice flooded back into his mind. I told him that I did not need him to fight my battles for me. I did not need him to throw a punch or create a massive physical scene. I simply needed him to stand up and acknowledge me as his father. I needed him to demonstrate the basic fundamental loyalty that any decent human being owes to the parent who sacrificed everything to raise them. Instead, he chose to look away. He chose to adjust his expensive cufflinks and pretend he did not know the man standing right in front of him. He chose the pathetic illusion of the Montgomery family wealth over the absolute reality of my unconditional love. I stated with absolute finality that his cowardly silence was the final failing grade of his lifelong character test. Matthew began to violently shake his head, his entire body trembling with sudden absolute terror. He stammered frantically, claiming that he was just overwhelmed by the massive wedding and did not know how to handle the sudden conflict. He begged me to understand that he was simply trying to keep the peace for his new bride. He desperately tried to justify his terrible betrayal, but his words sounded hollow and entirely pathetic inside the quiet living room. I did not offer him an ounce of sympathy. I slid a specific legal document out of the binder and pushed it across the wooden coffee table toward him. I instructed him to read the final paragraph of the morality clause. Matthew leaned forward, his eyes scanning the dense legal text with growing absolute horror. The clause stated explicitly that if the beneficiary demonstrated profound moral failure, extreme financial irresponsibility, or a complete lack of basic familial loyalty, the blind trust would be immediately and permanently dissolved. I explained the catastrophic legal mechanics of his failure. Because he had actively chosen the cruelty and arrogance of the Montgomery family over his own father, the trust had executed a massive structural adjustment. I told him that as of 8 o'clock this morning, my corporate attorneys had formally dissolved his status as the primary beneficiary. The entire multi-billion-dollar Foster Holdings corporate portfolio, the massive logistics empire, the commercial real estate, and every single liquid asset had been legally and irrevocably redirected into an absolute charitable foundation. Matthew gasped completely, unable to draw breath into his lungs. He stared at the legal document as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. He looked up at me, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated devastation. He asked me, in a tiny broken whisper, what exactly was left for him. He asked what his portion of the inheritance would be now that the trust was dissolved. I looked at my son, feeling the last remaining thread of our relationship permanently snap. I spoke the final, absolutely devastating truth. I told him that he gets zero. I told him that he gets absolutely nothing. There was no secret bank account waiting for him. There was no emergency trust fund to catch him when he fell. He had traded a billion-dollar empire for a family that was currently facing massive federal bankruptcy. He had thrown away his entire future to impress a woman who was right this very second threatening to divorce him if he did not return with my money. Matthew collapsed back into the armchair, entirely physically broken. The sheer magnitude of his catastrophic mistake crushed the very life out of him. He realized that his profound cowardice had not just cost him his dignity, it had cost him the greatest financial empire he would ever know. He sat in my living room completely paralyzed by the horrifying reality that he was now completely poor, entirely alone and bound to a toxic family that would violently discard him the moment he walked back through their front door empty-handed. I closed the heavy black leather binder with a loud, sharp snap that echoed through the quiet house like a gunshot. I told him that our business was permanently concluded and ordered him to leave my property immediately. The drive back to the Montgomery estate was the longest journey of Matthew's entire life. His hands gripped the steering wheel of his expensive sports car, so tightly his knuckles physically ached. He had left that sprawling mansion less than an hour ago, feeling like an arrogant prince on a noble rescue mission. He was returning as a completely broken beggar. Every single mile he drove felt like an agonizing march toward his own execution. He pulled his car into the circular driveway and parked near the massive marble fountain. The cascading water no longer looked like a beautiful symbol of infinite wealth and power. It simply looked like a ridiculous waste of money that nobody in that house could actually afford to maintain. Matthew sat in the driver's seat for a long time, staring at the heavy double front doors. He was absolutely terrified to walk inside. He knew exactly what kind of ruthless, desperate monsters were waiting for him in the formal living room. He forced himself out of the car and dragged his heavy feet up the stone steps. He pushed the front doors open and stepped into the grand foyer. The suffocating tension inside the mansion was instantly palpable. Howard, Diane, and Natalie were gathered in the main living area. They looked exactly like a pack of starving wolves waiting for a fresh meal. Howard was pacing back and forth across the expensive Persian rug, his face slick with cold sweat. Diane was sitting on the edge of the custom-upholstered sofa, nervously twisting the large diamond ring on her finger. Natalie stood near the massive stone fireplace with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The exact moment Matthew walked into the room, all three of them stopped moving entirely. 6 desperate, hungry eyes instantly locked onto his empty hands. They were frantically searching for a thick leather portfolio or a certified corporate check. They were searching for the millions of dollars that would magically erase their massive debts and save them from absolute federal ruin. Howard took a sudden, eager step forward. He did not ask Matthew how the conversation with his father went, or if he was okay. He aggressively demanded the money right away. He asked where the corporate check was, his voice trembling with a toxic mixture of desperate hope and underlying rage. Natalie stepped up right beside her father. She demanded that Matthew hand over the cash immediately so they could call their corporate lawyers and forcefully stop the bank foreclosure proceedings. Matthew stood completely frozen in the center of the expensive room. He felt entirely small and profoundly pathetic. He could not bring himself to look directly into the furious, expectant eyes of his new wife. He lowered his gaze to the polished hardwood floor and swallowed hard. He forced his trembling voice to finally work. He told them that there was absolutely no check. The formal living room instantly plunged into a dead, horrifying silence. Howard took another massive step forward, his face turning a dangerous shade of dark crimson. He aggressively demanded to know what Matthew was talking about. Howard yelled that Matthew was the sole legal heir to a multi-billion-dollar logistics empire, and ordered him to stop playing stupid, immature games. Natalie grabbed Matthew tightly by the shoulder and violently shook him. She screamed at him to explain exactly why he had returned completely empty-handed when her family was literally bleeding to death. Matthew finally looked up. His eyes were entirely hollow and defeated. He explained the terrifying legal reality of his situation with a weak, broken whisper. He told them about the massive, irrevocable blind trust. He explained the incredibly strict morality and character clauses that completely governed the distribution of the massive corporate wealth. He watched the blood entirely drain from Natalie's beautiful face as he described the catastrophic consequences of the wedding reception. He told the Montgomery family that because he had cowardly stood by and allowed them to publicly humiliate his father, the legal trust had been permanently and automatically dissolved. He confessed the absolute devastating truth. He told them that every single penny of the billions of dollars had been legally transferred to a charitable foundation. He told them that he had been completely disinherited. He told them that he possessed absolutely zero money and zero power. The reaction from the Montgomery family was not one of sympathy or basic human understanding. It was a massive, violent explosion of pure, vicious hatred. Howard Montgomery let out a loud, agonizing roar of absolute, total defeat. He grabbed an expensive imported crystal vase from the side table and violently hurled it across the room. The vase shattered against the stone fireplace, raining sharp crystal fragments all over the floor. Howard screamed that Matthew was the most useless, pathetic excuse for a human being he had ever met. He yelled that Matthew had doomed them all with his cowardly, pathetic weakness. Howard realized in that exact second that he was completely out of options. He was going to lose his luxury import business, his sprawling mansion, and quite possibly his personal freedom. The terrified boy standing in front of him offered absolutely no financial leverage whatsoever. Diane immediately shifted into ruthless high society survival mode. The polished, elegant matriarch completely vanished. She turned her furious gaze toward her daughter. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at Matthew and issued a cold, absolute command. Diane told Natalie that she must completely sever all legal ties with this useless boy immediately. Diane explained with terrifying clinical precision that the Montgomery family was already drowning in massive toxic debt. She stated firmly that remaining legally associated with the permanently disinherited son of the man actively destroying them was a catastrophic liability they simply could not afford. Diane demanded that Natalie file for a complete legal annulment the very next morning. Howard loudly agreed with his wife. He stepped aggressively into Matthew's personal space and ordered him to get out of his house. He told Matthew that he was a contagious disease and a complete embarrassment. Matthew looked desperately at Natalie, begging his new bride to defend him. He hoped that the sacred vows they had taken just a few short days ago meant absolutely anything to her. Natalie did not shed a single tear. She did not reach out to comfort the man she had solemnly promised to love in sickness and in health. She looked at Matthew with absolute, pure, unadulterated disgust. She told him that her mother was entirely right. She stated coldly that she had absolutely no intention of spending her entire life married to a broke, pathetic warehouse worker who could not even secure his own birthright. She told Matthew that their marriage was a complete, ridiculous mistake, and that she never wanted to see his face ever again. In the span of a few brutal minutes, Matthew realized the terrifying, absolute truth. Without my money to give him immense value, he was completely worthless to the people he had sacrificed his own father to impress. He was being violently thrown away like a piece of worthless garbage. I learned the precise details of my son's humiliating departure from the private investigator I had quietly hired to monitor the Montgomery estate during their financial collapse. After the violent shouting in the formal living room finally ceased, Natalie did not waste another single second. The fiery rage she had displayed earlier completely vanished, replaced by a chilling, mechanical efficiency. She marched up the grand, sweeping staircase to the master bedroom, and Matthew followed closely behind her, begging for a second chance. He pleaded with her to remember the vows they had taken just days ago. He promised her that he would find a high-paying job and that they could build a new life together from scratch. Natalie completely ignored his desperate rambling. She walked directly to the massive walk-in closet and pulled out the single cheap canvas suitcase Matthew had brought with him when he moved in. She threw it violently onto the plush mattress and pointed a perfectly manicured finger at his face. She told him he had exactly 5 minutes to pack his pathetic off-the-rack clothes and get out of her sight forever. Matthew stood frozen in the center of the luxurious bedroom, unable to comprehend the absolute speed of his total rejection. He watched his new wife violently yank his faded cotton shirts and inexpensive dress slacks off the custom cedar hangers. She tossed his meager belongings into the open suitcase with profound disgust, as if his clothing was entirely contaminated. Matthew tried to reach out and gently touch her arm, hoping to spark a tiny fraction of human empathy. Natalie recoiled instantly, as if she had been burned by a hot iron. She looked at his trembling hand and told him with absolute venom that he was nothing but a massive, repulsive mistake. She stated clearly that she was already drafting the annulment papers and that her high-powered lawyers would ensure he walked away with absolutely nothing. She zipped the canvas suitcase shut with a loud, sharp pull and shoved it forcefully into his chest. She ordered him to take his garbage and leave her property before she called the local police and had him arrested for trespassing. Matthew clutched the cheap suitcase tightly against his chest. The heavy canvas felt like the only solid object left in his entire rapidly collapsing world. He slowly turned and walked out of the master bedroom, dragging his feet across the thick, expensive carpet. He descended the grand marble staircase for the very last time, his mind flashing back to the warm, comfortable home I had provided for him his entire life. He realized too late that the simple house he had so deeply despised was filled with genuine love, while this massive stone fortress was completely empty and cold. When he reached the grand foyer, he saw Howard and Diane Montgomery standing near the formal dining room. They did not look angry anymore. They looked at my son with the cold, empty indifference one might reserve for a dead insect on the floor. Howard was already aggressively dialing his mobile phone, frantically trying to reach his defense attorneys to salvage his own ruined life. Diane was busy calculating which of her wealthy friends she could easily manipulate for a temporary loan. Neither of them offered Matthew a single word of farewell. They had completely deleted him from their reality the exact moment they realized he possessed absolutely no financial value. Natalie marched down the stairs right behind him and forcefully opened the heavy double front doors. The late afternoon air was cold and entirely unforgiving. Matthew stepped slowly over the threshold, feeling the heavy weight of his absolute failure pressing down on his shoulders. He turned around to look at his beautiful wife one last time, desperately hoping she would suddenly change her mind and call him back inside. Natalie stood perfectly framed in the opulent doorway of the sprawling stone mansion. She did not shed a tear or offer a sad smile. She simply looked at him with cold, dead eyes and slammed the heavy oak doors violently shut in his face. The loud booming sound echoed across the circular driveway, sealing his fate with absolute devastating finality. He heard the heavy brass deadbolt slide into place, locking him out of the luxurious world he had sacrificed his own father to join. Matthew stood completely alone on the pristine paved driveway, holding a cheap canvas suitcase containing the only possessions he had left in the world. He had no cash in his wallet, because his personal bank accounts were completely frozen by the corporate financial sweep. He had no credit cards he could use to rent a cheap motel room or buy a warm meal. He had absolutely nowhere to go. He walked slowly down the long, winding driveway toward the main suburban street, his expensive Italian leather shoes scraping heavily against the asphalt. He reached the end of the property line and stood on the public sidewalk, watching the luxury cars drive past him in the fading light. The sun began to set, casting long, dark shadows across the neighborhood he used to think he belonged in. He had traded a multi-billion-dollar corporate empire and the unconditional love of a devoted father for a temporary illusion of high society acceptance. He had chosen the toxic cruelty of the Montgomery family over basic human decency, and now he was reaping the absolute horrific reward of his profound betrayal. He was left entirely homeless, completely broke, and profoundly alone on a darkening street. The silent adjustment regarding my son was now absolutely complete. The following 72 hours completely dismantled Howard Montgomery. The initial shock of the bank freeze rapidly mutated into a massive legal nightmare. On Wednesday morning, agents from the Federal Revenue Service arrived at his locked distribution warehouses at the southern port. They were not there to help him. They had been discreetly tipped off by the frozen corporate bank accounts and were launching a full forensic audit of his entire import business. Howard knew perfectly well that his private accounting books were completely filled with massive illegal discrepancies. He had spent the last decade submitting fraudulent loan applications based on phantom collateral to maintain his high society lifestyle. If the federal auditors dug deep enough into those files, he would not just lose his luxury business, he would face a decade in federal prison for massive bank fraud. His aggressive defense attorneys demanded a massive cash retainer to even look at the federal subpoenas. Because he had absolutely no access to his frozen credit lines, the lawyers completely abandoned him without a second thought. His mobile phone rang constantly, with furious calls from panicked international suppliers and aggressive domestic creditors demanding their delayed payments. The luxury import empire he had spent decades building on a foundation of lies was rapidly evaporating into thin air. By Thursday afternoon, the commercial bank had formally served the aggressive foreclosure papers on his sprawling stone mansion. He was trapped in a rapidly sinking ship, and the freezing cold water was already rushing violently over his head. Howard had absolutely no moves left to play. His towering arrogance had been completely burned away by the terrifying reality of his impending criminal charges. He realized with absolute horror that the only person on the entire planet who possessed the financial power to stop the federal auditors and unlock his bank accounts was the exact same man he had viciously humiliated in front of 500 high society guests. On Friday morning, Howard did not put on his custom-tailored Italian suit. He wore a wrinkled dress shirt and a pair of simple slacks he had slept in for 2 agonizing days. He looked entirely disheveled, his face pale and covered in a thick gray shadow of rough stubble. He drove his leased silver luxury car into the heart of the downtown financial district. He parked illegally on the busy street and walked slowly toward the towering glass and steel skyscraper that served as the global headquarters for Foster Holdings. He looked up at the massive building that completely dominated the city skyline. It was a terrifying physical manifestation of the absolute power he had foolishly provoked. He walked through the heavy revolving glass doors, stepping into a massive lobby constructed of imported white marble and brushed steel. The corporate lobby was a sanctuary of quiet, highly efficient power. Wealthy investors and sharp corporate executives moved purposefully across the polished marble floor. Howard approached the massive curved reception desk, feeling entirely out of place and profoundly small. The receptionist was a highly professional woman, wearing a dark, tailored suit. Howard placed his trembling hands on the cool marble counter and asked to speak directly with Mitchell Foster. The receptionist asked if he had a scheduled appointment. Howard shook his head, his voice cracking as he admitted he did not. He desperately explained that it was a matter of absolute life and death regarding the Montgomery import business. The receptionist typed a few keys on her sleek computer terminal and politely informed him that the chief executive officer did not take unannounced meetings under any circumstances. She calmly instructed him to contact the legal department and asked him to step aside so she could successfully assist the next important client. The polite rejection completely shattered the last remaining fragments of Howard's fragile sanity. The terrifying thought of federal prison suddenly overwhelmed his senses. He gripped the marble counter tightly and began to shout. He did not shout with his usual booming arrogance. He shouted with the high-pitched, frantic desperation of a completely broken man. He yelled that he was going to lose absolutely everything he owned if he did not speak to Mitchell right this very second. He begged the receptionist to pick up her phone and tell the executive office that Howard Montgomery was downstairs entirely ready to surrender. The sudden loud noise echoed harshly across the quiet, sophisticated lobby. Several wealthy executives stopped walking and turned to stare in absolute shock at the disheveled man causing a frantic public scene. Within seconds, 4 highly trained corporate security officers in dark suits appeared from the shadows and quickly surrounded Howard. They placed their firm hands on his shoulders, preparing to physically, forcefully eject him from the massive building. Howard began to thrash wildly against their heavy grip, crying real tears of absolute terror. At that exact moment, the polished steel doors of the private executive elevator silently slid open. I walked out into the massive marble lobby accompanied by my corporate counsel, Gordon Reed. I was no longer wearing the simple off-the-rack wool suit I had worn to the wedding. I wore a dark, perfectly tailored bespoke suit that projected absolute, unyielding authority. The security officers immediately stopped moving and stood at strict attention the moment they saw me approach. Howard stopped thrashing. He stared at me with wide, bloodshot eyes, completely breathless. He saw the genuine respect and absolute fear I commanded from every single person in the massive room. He finally realized the true monumental scale of the dragon he had carelessly awakened. The poor old man he had mocked was entirely gone, replaced by a cold corporate titan who held his entire pathetic existence in the palm of his hand. Howard did not try to maintain his dignity. He completely collapsed. His knees hit the hard, polished marble floor with a loud, painful thud. He knelt directly in front of me in the middle of the crowded corporate lobby, entirely ignoring the shocked stares of the wealthy executives standing nearby. He clasped his trembling hands together and began to beg for his life. He openly wept, tears streaming rapidly down his pale, unshaven face. He apologized frantically for the terrible events at the wedding reception. He told me that his wife was a foolish, arrogant woman, and that he was deeply, deeply sorry for allowing her to throw that money at my feet. He begged me to unlock his shipping warehouses and call off the aggressive bank foreclosure. He cried that the Federal Revenue Service was going to send him to prison and completely destroy his entire family. He offered to publicly apologize to me in front of the entire city. He offered to drop to his knees and scrub the floors of my building if I would just show him a single ounce of mercy. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the weeping, broken man kneeling on my polished marble floor. I did not feel a single drop of pity for him. I knew that his tears were not tears of genuine remorse for his cruel behavior. They were simply tears of absolute terror because he had finally been caught and completely destroyed. He was only sorry because he was currently experiencing the catastrophic consequences of his own toxic arrogance. I let him cry and beg for several long, agonizing minutes, letting the profound humiliation burn itself deeply into his memory forever. The entire corporate lobby was completely dead silent, watching the absolute destruction of Howard Montgomery. I did not raise my voice or offer him any comforting words. I looked at Gordon Reed and gave him a single cold nod. The time for silent observation was entirely over, and the time for the final clinical execution had officially arrived. I did not speak a single word to Howard Montgomery, while he remained kneeling on the polished marble floor of the corporate lobby. I simply turned my back on his weeping form and walked toward the private executive elevator. My corporate counsel, Gordon Reed, gestured for the security officers to pull the broken man to his feet. Howard stumbled after us into the elevator car, entirely stripped of his aggressive arrogance. The ride up to the 50th floor was completely silent. The only sound in the confined space was the heavy, ragged breathing of a man who knew he was walking directly to his own execution. The polished steel doors smoothly slid open to reveal the primary executive boardroom of Foster Holdings. It was a massive room designed specifically to intimidate and dominate. The long conference table was carved from a single pristine slab of dark imported walnut. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping, unobstructed view of the entire financial district. It was the exact kind of room Howard had spent his entire adult life desperately pretending he belonged in. Now he was entering it as a complete captive. I walked the length of the room and took my seat at the head of the long table. Gordon Reed stood silently by my side, opening his thick leather briefcase. I motioned for Howard to sit in the single leather chair positioned at the far opposite end of the table. He collapsed heavily into the seat, looking entirely small and completely defeated by the sheer scale of the power surrounding him. Howard immediately opened his mouth to start begging again. He started to frantically apologize for his wife and his entitled daughter, desperately trying to shift the blame to his family. I raised my hand just an inch off the table, and his trembling voice instantly died in his throat. I told him in a cold, completely flat tone that the time for social apologies had permanently expired the exact moment his wife threw that $50 bill onto the ballroom floor. I stated clearly that we were not here to discuss my son or his daughter. We were not here to discuss the profound cruelty of his high society circle. We were here strictly to discuss the massive, catastrophic financial crimes he had been actively committing for the past 10 years. The remaining color completely drained from Howard's pale face. He gripped the thick leather armrests of his chair, his knuckles turning entirely white. Gordon Reed pulled a thick red legal binder from his briefcase and dropped it onto the center of the walnut table. The loud, solid thud echoed sharply in the quiet room, making Howard visibly jump in his seat. I looked directly into Howard's terrified eyes and began to systematically dismantle his entire fraudulent life. I explained that when my venture capital firm flagged his corporate accounts for review, we did not just freeze his credit lines. We executed a comprehensive and highly aggressive forensic audit of his entire luxury import business. I told him that Gordon had spent the last 48 hours uncovering a massive complex web of corporate fraud. I listed his devastating crimes with absolute clinical precision. I detailed exactly how he had systematically fabricated international shipping manifests to artificially inflate the value of his warehouse inventory. I explained how he had aggressively leveraged that phantom collateral to secure millions of dollars in commercial loans from First National Commerce. I told him that we had definitive, undeniable proof he was using newly acquired corporate debt to illegally fund his lavish personal lifestyle, including the sprawling stone mansion and the extravagant $500,000 wedding he had just hosted. I watched his jaw physically tremble as I laid out the exact federal statutes he had knowingly violated. I stated firmly that he had committed massive wire fraud, severe bank fraud, and extensive tax evasion. I told him that the federal revenue agents currently crawling through his locked warehouses at the southern port were just the beginning. I explained that by the end of the week, the Federal Bureau of Investigation would freeze his passport and issue a formal warrant for his immediate criminal arrest. I stated that the minimum mandatory sentence for the sheer massive volume of his financial crimes was 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Howard began to violently shake. He tried to deny the accusations, but his weak voice completely failed him. He knew perfectly well that I held the absolute undeniable proof of his guilt sitting right there on the table. He looked at the thick red binder as if it contained his actual death warrant. He begged me to stop the federal auditors. He cried that he was 60 years old and would absolutely die in a concrete federal prison cell. He pleaded with me to use my massive corporate influence to make the federal investigation simply disappear. He promised to sign over 50% of his import business to me immediately. He frantically offered to make me an equal partner if I would just provide the liquid capital to cover his massive fraudulent loans. I looked at him with profound, absolute disgust. He still believed he had something of actual value to offer. He still believed he was a powerful businessman negotiating a high-level corporate merger. I completely shattered that ridiculous, pathetic illusion. I told him that his company was entirely worthless. It was nothing but a hollow, rotting shell completely filled with toxic debt. I stated that I had absolutely no interest in becoming a business partner with a pathetic criminal. Gordon Reed slid a single piece of heavy legal paper down the long walnut table. It stopped perfectly in front of Howard. I reached into the interior pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out my leather wallet. I extracted a crisp single $1 bill. I placed the dollar bill on the polished wood and slowly slid it down the table until it rested directly on top of the legal document. Howard stared at the single piece of paper money in absolute, complete confusion. I explained the exact terms of his corporate execution. I told him that he was going to legally sell his entire import business, his distribution network, his locked inventory, and his corporate brand to Foster Holdings right this very second. I stated that the official purchase price for his entire life's work was exactly $1. In exchange for transferring 100% of his equity, I would use my venture capital firm to completely absorb his massive corporate debt. I would personally pay off the millions of dollars he owed to the commercial banks. I explained that once the banks were fully repaid, there would be no institutional victims of fraud, and the Federal Revenue Service would be forced to immediately drop their criminal investigation. I told him that I was offering to save him from spending the rest of his natural life in a federal prison, but the absolute cost was his entire empire. Howard stared at the $1 bill, his eyes welling up with fresh tears of absolute devastation. He slowly realized the profound, merciless poetry of the situation. His arrogant wife had proudly thrown a $50 bill at my feet to completely strip me of my human dignity. I was now forcing him to sell his entire corporate empire for a single dollar bill to completely strip him of his absolute freedom and power. He tried to speak, his voice a broken, pathetic whisper echoing in the large room. He asked me how he was supposed to survive without his company. He asked how he would pay the massive mortgage on his stone mansion, or support his demanding high society wife without a single source of income. I did not offer him a single ounce of sympathy. I told him that his sprawling mansion was already in active foreclosure and would be seized by the commercial bank within a week. I told him that his demanding wife would likely leave him the exact moment she realized the money was permanently gone. I stated with absolute finality that his personal survival was no longer my concern. I pointed a single steady finger at the legal document and told him he had exactly 10 seconds to sign the paper, or Gordon Reed would immediately hand the red binder full of evidence directly to the federal authorities waiting downstairs in the lobby. Howard looked at the heavy gold pen resting next to the contract. His hands shook violently as he reached out and picked it up. He looked around the massive, beautiful boardroom, realizing with absolute crushing certainty that this was the very last time he would ever sit in a room like this. He was completely trapped. He had absolutely no leverage, no allies, and zero alternatives. He slowly lowered the gold pen to the heavy paper and signed his name. His signature was shaky and weak, completely lacking the aggressive, bold, confident strokes he usually employed to intimidate his rivals. He signed away his company. He signed away his wealth. He completely signed his entire life away for a single dollar bill. Gordon Reed immediately stepped forward and pulled the signed contract away, placing it securely into his thick leather briefcase. Gordon did not take the dollar bill. He left it sitting on the polished walnut table directly in front of Howard. I stood up from my leather chair and adjusted my suit jacket. I looked down the long table at the completely ruined man sitting in the shadows. I told him that our business was permanently concluded. I instructed him to take his dollar and leave my building immediately. I turned and walked out of the massive boardroom, leaving Howard Montgomery completely alone to face the absolute devastating reality of his new, impoverished existence. The rapid collapse of the Montgomery family was a spectacle that the local high society watched with absolute ruthless fascination. Exactly 7 days after Howard signed his entire corporate empire away for a single paper dollar, the commercial bank executed the final foreclosure on his sprawling stone mansion. There were no professional moving trucks hired to carefully transport their expensive imported furniture. The bank aggressively seized absolutely everything inside the house to cover the massive remaining personal debts. Howard and Diane were forced to pack whatever basic clothing they could fit into the trunks of 2 cheap rented sedans. They relocated to a cramped 2-bedroom apartment situated in a completely rundown neighborhood on the extreme outer edge of the city. The apartment building smelled constantly of stale cigarette smoke and boiled cabbage. The drywall was incredibly thin, allowing them to hear every single argument their angry neighbors had. Diane, who had spent the last 2 decades commanding a massive staff of private servants, was now forced to scrub her own dishes in a chipped porcelain sink. She spent her days sitting on a cheap fabric sofa, staring blankly at the stained wallpaper, completely paralyzed by her sudden devastating poverty. She tried to sell her remaining designer dresses to local consignment shops just to afford basic groceries. She had no elite country club to attend. She had no prestigious charity galas to organize. Her wealthy friends had completely blocked her phone number the exact minute the news of their federal bankruptcy became public. Howard simply sat in the small kitchen staring at the peeling linoleum floor. He had entirely lost his booming, arrogant voice. He was forced to ride the public city bus to attend his endless legal meetings because his leased luxury cars had been repossessed. He was a completely hollow shell of a man, entirely broken by the undeniable knowledge that his own toxic greed had permanently destroyed his life. Natalie did not fare any better in the brutal aftermath of their financial execution. She had immediately filed for a legal annulment, exactly as her mother had commanded, completely discarding Matthew like a piece of worthless garbage. She foolishly believed that her youth and physical beauty would easily allow her to secure another wealthy husband to rescue her from the cramped apartment. She was completely wrong. The high society circle she worshipped was incredibly vicious and highly unforgiving. The Montgomery name had become entirely synonymous with massive corporate fraud and public disgrace. The wealthy men she tried to manipulate completely avoided her, treating her like a highly contagious disease. She was no longer a beautiful, wealthy heiress. She was simply the desperate daughter of a ruined criminal trying to survive on the fringes of a world that had permanently locked her out. Driven by the absolute necessity of paying her mounting legal bills, she was forced to take a humiliating job working as a cosmetic sales clerk in a local shopping mall. She spent her days standing on her feet for 8 agonizing hours, forcing a fake smile and applying cheap makeup to the exact working-class women she used to aggressively mock. She had to endure rude customers who snapped their fingers at her and treated her exactly like a subservient peasant. Every single time she looked into the bright fluorescent mirror at the mall, she was violently reminded of the massive billionaire empire she had foolishly thrown away. Her punishment was the absolute, complete loss of her perceived social superiority. My son Matthew experienced the most profound and poetic justice of them all. When Natalie violently kicked him out of the mansion, he had absolutely nowhere to go and zero financial resources to rely on. His expensive college degree in art history was completely useless in the real world, and he had absolutely no practical skills to leverage. Driven by the absolute sheer necessity of basic daily survival, he was forced to visit a local employment agency looking for any physical manual labor he could find. The agency assigned him to a minimum wage position, working the grueling overnight shift at a massive regional logistics center. He was hired to drive a heavy forklift and manually load massive wooden pallets into the back of commercial transport trucks. On his very first night of work, he was handed a bright yellow safety vest and a cheap plastic identification badge. When he looked down at the badge, his heart completely stopped. Printed directly across the top of the plastic card, in bold black letters, was the corporate logo for Foster Holdings. He had unknowingly applied for a job at one of the very distribution warehouses I personally owned. He was now working at the absolute bottom level of the massive multi-billion-dollar empire that should have been his birthright. He spent 10 hours every single night breathing in heavy diesel exhaust fumes and lifting heavy boxes until his muscles screamed in agonizing physical pain. The cold night wind whipped through the open loading docks, freezing his hands until they were completely covered in thick, painful blisters. He was treated with zero special respect by his demanding shift supervisors. He was just another expendable warehouse laborer, completely identified by a random employee number. He spent his short lunch breaks sitting completely alone in the bleak concrete break room, eating cheap cold sandwiches. Above him, a small television constantly played corporate training videos that proudly featured the massive success and history of his own father. Sometimes, when I was sitting in my executive office reviewing the weekly security feeds, I would bring up the camera for that specific logistics center. I would watch my son driving the forklift, his face covered in dark soot and sweat. I did not feel a single drop of pity for him. I did not feel any parental urge to rescue him from his grueling physical labor. He was finally learning the exact lesson I had tried to teach him his entire life. He was finally learning the absolute true value of a single dollar earned through genuine hard work. He had actively chosen the arrogant, toxic path of the Montgomery family, and this heavy, agonizing labor was the permanent destination of that terrible choice. As for myself, I completely stepped away from the aggressive daily operations of the corporate empire. I transferred the majority of my executive responsibilities to Gordon Reed and a board of highly trusted directors. The massive wealth that had been legally secured within the dissolved blind trust was completely redirected into a newly established charitable foundation. We began building community centers, funding advanced medical research, and completely paying off the educational debts of bright young students who actually demonstrated genuine moral character. The massive money that the Montgomery family had tried to aggressively steal to fund their toxic luxury was now being used to actively heal the world they had despised. I returned to the quiet, peaceful life I had always preferred. I am currently sitting on the wooden porch of my modest suburban house right where this final chapter truly began. The afternoon sun is warm, and the rusted 1998 pickup truck is still parked exactly where it belongs in the driveway. I am holding a simple ceramic mug filled with hot black coffee. The house is completely silent, but the silence is no longer heavy with unspoken resentment or bitter disappointment. It is not the suffocating silence of a crowded ballroom or the terrifying silence of a frozen bank account. It is the beautiful, absolute silence of a life completely restored to perfect order. I protected the legacy my late wife and I built with our own two hands. I removed the toxic elements from my existence with absolute clinical precision. I proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that true power does not need to shout to be heard. I hope my story serves as a strict warning to anyone who mistakes quiet humility for pathetic weakness. Never underestimate the quiet people in the room, because they are usually the ones carefully studying the entire board while you are just blindly playing with the pieces. Did you like my story? Please let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. If you enjoyed listening to this exact story, please support the channel by hitting the like button and subscribing for more content. You can also send a super thanks to help me continue sharing these powerful life lessons. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next story.